The crash of porcelain on stone was a sound Cora knew intimately. It echoed the shattering of her own composure, a sharp, splintering noise that stole the air from her lungs. Shards of the fine china, painted with delicate bluebells, skittered across the flagstones like frightened mice. Her mother, Lady Genevieve, didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. Her silence was a weapon, honed to a razor's edge. "Look at what you've done," she said, her voice a low, chilling whisper that cut deeper than any shout. "Clumsy. Useless." Cora opened her mouth, the apology a physical weight on her tongue. Tss. The word caught in her throat, a knot of thorns. The harder she pushed, the tighter it became, her face flushed with a hot, prickling shame. Her older sister, Isolde, leaned against the doorframe, a perfect picture of bored elegance. A faint, cruel smile played on her lips as she watched Cora's struggle. "Don't even try, sister," Isolde sighed, examining her immaculate nails. "It's painful for everyone." Cora's hands trembled. She knelt, her fingers carefully picking up the larger pieces, avoiding her mother's cold stare. Each shard felt like a piece of her own worthlessness, sharp and undeniable. She didn't need them to say the word. Stammerer. It was the label stitched into the very fabric of her being, the reason she was kept in the shadows of the decaying Harrowfall estate, a flawed piece of property, a burden, She escaped to the only place that didn't demand words, the neglected garden. Here, amidst the skeletal remains of rose bushes and choked weeds, was a small patch of earth that answered only to her. She knelt, the damp soil cool against her palms. Her shame receded, replaced by a quiet hum she felt in her bones. She leaned close to a withered lavender plant, its stalks brittle and gray. A soft rhythmic sound escaped her lips, not words, but a low melodic murmur. It was the senseless murmuring her family despised, the sound she made when the pressure of speech became too much. But here, it was a language. The plant seemed to lean into the sound, a faint tremor running through its dried leaves. She felt the thirst in its roots, the faint pulse of life struggling beneath the blight. Her touch was a promise, a quiet communion the world of polished floors and cutting words could never understand. That evening, the air at the dinner table was thick with a tension that felt different from the usual simmering resentment. It was heavy, final. Lord Corbin cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. He didn't look at Cora, instead addressing the peeling wallpaper as if it were a member of his council. "An arrangement has been made," he announced, his voice flat and transactional. "Cora has been chosen for a service, one that will bring considerable relief to this house." Lady Genevieve's shoulders relaxed for the first time in months, a flicker of cold satisfaction in her eyes. Isolde's interest was piqued, her gaze sliding to Cora with a new calculating curiosity. Cora's fork froze halfway to her mouth. A block of ice formed in her stomach, spreading a numbing cold through her veins. She felt their eyes on her, not as a daughter or a sister, but as a ledger entry, a debt finally being settled. "What service?" Isolde asked, a hint of disdain in her tone. Lord Corbin finally met Cora's gaze. His eyes were like chips of flint, devoid of warmth or pity. "She will serve in silence, as she always have. It is the only value you possess." The words hung in the air, an epitaph for a life that had barely begun. There was no room for questions, no space for the silent scream building in her chest. She was a thing to be sold, a sacrifice to appease the creditors that circled their crumbling name. All she could do was nod, the motion stiff and jerky, her acceptance a final silent surrender. She was a burden, and this was how burdens were unmade. Later, in the cold darkness of her small room, she gathered her meager possessions. A threadbare dress, a worn-out pair of shoes. Her fingers brushed against a small wooden bird, tucked away in a loose floorboard. Its wing was chipped, a gift from a grandfather long gone, the last person whose voice had held kindness for her. She clutched it in her palm, the splintered wood a familiar pain. It was the only thing of value she owned, a broken thing for a broken girl. As she walked out of the great oak doors of Harrowfall, she didn't look back. The night air was cold, smelling of rain and decay. She was walking toward a new life, but she held no illusions. It was not a life of freedom, but of service, of slavery, perhaps even of death. It was, her father had made clear, the only value she had. The bonding market was a lie dressed in festive colors. Banners flapped in the biting wind, but their bright hues couldn't mask the scent of despair that clung to the air like wood smoke. It smelled of damp straw and fear. Cora stood on a low wooden platform, her head bowed, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. She was an object among other objects, a collection of disposable sons and daughters sold to settle debts or forge worthless alliances. She kept her eyes fixed on a splinter in the wood beneath her feet, focusing on its jagged lines, willing herself to become just as small, just as insignificant. Then, The air changed. The cheerful din of the market faltered, the sound dying in people's throats. A silence spread from the edge of the square, heavy and absolute. The crowd parted, a human tide receding from an unstoppable force. Cora felt a tremor in the platform beneath her, the rhythmic thud of heavy, purposeful steps. She didn't have to look up to know. Power like that had a physical weight, a presence that bent the world around it. He was a giant, a figure carved from mountain stone in ancient winter. King Rorik of the Shadowfang Pack, nearly 7 feet of scarred muscle and grim authority, wrapped in dark furs and worn leather. At his heels, moving with a predator's liquid silence, were 2 enormous black wolves. Their eyes were molten gold, intelligent and unsettling, perfect mirrors of the man they followed. A collective shiver went through the crowd. This was not a buyer. This was a conqueror surveying his spoils. Cora's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. He would pass her by. He had to. She was plain, small, broken. There were beautiful girls with hair like spun gold and proud boys with chins held high. He walked past them all, his gaze sweeping over them with disinterest. And then he stopped, directly in front of her. The heat rolling off his body was a palpable force, a wall of warmth in the cold air. He smelled of pine needles, of cold steel, and of the clean, sharp scent of a coming storm. She flinched, curling into herself, expecting a rough hand, a cruel word, the final, brutal transaction. The market organizer, a man with a nervous sweat beading on his upper lip, scurried forward. "She's quiet, my king," he chirped, his voice strained. "Obedient. Causes no trouble." From the edge of the crowd, a low, disguised voice muttered, just loud enough to be carried on the wind. It was her father, Lord Corbin, his face hidden by a heavy cowl. "She's a stammerer," he spat to a neighboring merchant. "Practically a defective." The word struck Cora like stones. Defective, broken, useless. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the final humiliation. But it didn't come. Instead, the Lycan King's immense presence shifted. He turned his head slightly, and though his expression didn't change, the air crackled with a sudden, lethal energy. His golden eyes, which had been impassive, now held a dangerous light. He turned his gaze back to Cora. To everyone's astonishment, the colossal king inclined his head, a gesture of profound, impossible respect. His voice, when he finally spoke, was not a shout. It was a low rumble, like the shifting of tectonic plates. Yet every soul in the square heard it as if he had whispered it in their ear. "They call it a flaw," he said, his eyes locked on her trembling form. "I call it the mark of the wild earth, something your tamed people have forgotten how to honor." He lifted a hand, large and calloused, scarred from 100 battles. He did not touch her. He simply offered it, palm up. A choice. A lifeline. Cora stared at it, her mind reeling. The warmth from his skin seemed to reach across the space between them. For the first time, she lifted her head, her gaze meeting his. There was no pity in his golden eyes. There was no disgust. There was only an unnerving certainty, a look of recognition, as if he had been searching for her his entire life. "Your nightmare ends now," he said, the words a solemn vow. He then turned to the stunned organizer. "Her bond. What is the price?" The man stammered, naming a figure that was insultingly low. Rorik didn't even acknowledge it. He motioned to one of his men, who stepped forward and slammed a heavy wooden chest onto the ground. The lid was thrown open, revealing a blinding hoard of gold. 10,000 gold crowns, Rorik announced, his voice cutting through the silence. "Let it be known that the King of Shadowfang does not buy servants. He claims what is his." Lord Corbin's hidden gasp was a small, satisfying sound of utter ruin. The journey to Shadowfang Keep was a blur of sensations Cora had never known. Rorik lifted her from the platform as if she were made of spun glass, his touch surprisingly gentle. He placed her on the back of his massive warhorse, a beast as black and imposing as its master. She sat before him, small and fragile against the hard plains of his chest. When the wind picked up, carrying the first sharp sting of snow, he unwrapped his own heavy fur-lined cloak and draped it around her shoulders. The warmth was immediate, sinking deep into her chilled bones. The fur was impossibly soft against her cheek, and it carried his scent, pine and storm and something fundamentally wild. It was a scent of safety. She was surrounded by him, shielded from the wind by his body, cocooned in his warmth. The steady, powerful beat of his heart against her back was a constant grounding rhythm. It was the most profound comfort she had ever felt. She did not speak. He did not ask her to. The silence between them wasn't empty or awkward. It was a shared space, peaceful and solid. As they rode through the darkening woods, his wolves loping alongside them, Cora watched the gnarled branches of the trees pass by. For 19 years, she had been a ghost in her own home, a silent burden whose only value was in being discarded. But in the arms of this fearsome king, wrapped in his cloak, She felt something stirring within her chest. It was a strange, fragile feeling, one she couldn't name. But it felt, impossibly, like the first thaw of a long and bitter winter. It felt like the beginning of Worth. The gates of Shadowfang Keep were not forged from cold iron, but grown from the living heartwood of ancient trees, their surfaces seamless and strong. As they swung open without a sound, a wave of warmth washed over Cora, carrying the scent of hearth smoke, roasting meat, and damp, fertile earth. It was the smell of life, a stark contrast to the cloying decay of Harrowfall. The keep was not a fortress built against the world, but one carved into the mountain itself, a living extension of the stone. Waterfalls cascaded down moss-covered walls into serene pools, and soft phosphorescent fungi cast a gentle, ethereal glow along the vaulted ceilings. There was no formal receiving line, no stiff courtiers. Instead, the lichens of the pack, who had gathered in the great hall, simply stopped what they were doing. Men and women, their forms powerful and their eyes holding the same golden light as their king, turned to look at her. Cora braced for the familiar wave of contempt, the pitying stares, but it never came. Instead, one by one, they inclined their heads, not in fear of Rorik, but in a quiet, profound gesture of respect for her. They saw her not as a stammerer, not as a burden, but as the king's chosen. Their gazes held a deep, unnerving curiosity, mixed with a reverence that made her skin tingle. An older she-wolf, with silver-streaked hair and eyes as kind as they were, wise stepped forward. "I am Elara," she said, her voice a low, soothing melody. "Welcome home, Luna." The word, Luna, hung in the air, foreign and impossibly heavy. Rorik placed a hand on the small of Cora's back, a silent transfer of strength. "Elara will see to your needs," he rumbled, his voice for her alone. "You are safe here." Elara led Cora through halls of polished stone and living wood to a suite of rooms that stole her breath. A fire crackled in a vast stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on walls hung with soft, woven tapestries. But it was the bathing chamber that made her stop. A deep, stone-carved tub steamed gently, the water infused with lavender and chamomile. The scent was a balm to her frayed nerves. The ritual of care was performed with a tenderness that was almost painful. Elara helped her out of the threadbare dress, her touch gentle, her expression unjudging of the thinness of Cora's frame or the faint bruises on her skin. The hot water was a shock, a liquid embrace that sank deep into her bones, chasing away years of accumulated chill. As Elara washed her hair, the grime and dust of the market, of Harrowfall, of her entire life, seemed to sluice away, leaving her feeling raw and new. She didn't just feel clean, she felt purified, as if she were shedding an old, ill-fitting skin. Afterward, laid out on the bed were clothes made of fabrics she had only ever seen on her sister. A chemise of soft, breathable linen, trousers of supple, dark leather that moved with her like a second skin, and a tunic of deep forest green wool, so fine it felt like velvet. They fit perfectly. When she looked at her reflection in a polished silver mirror, she saw a stranger. The familiar, hunched posture was gone, replaced by a straightness she didn't recognize. Her face, scrubbed clean, was pale, but her eyes seemed clearer, wider. For the first time, she wasn't looking at a flaw. She was just looking at a girl. That night, a tray of food was brought to her. A thick, savory stew, rich with venison and root vegetables, and a slice of dark, dense bread still warm from the oven. She ate slowly, savoring every mouthful. It was the first meal she had ever eaten that wasn't a leftover scrap or a silent, tense ordeal. It was nourishment. It was a welcome. It was an offering of peace. Weeks turned into a quiet rhythm of safety. Cora found her solace not in the grand halls, but in the sprawling greenhouses and gardens that were the lifeblood of the keep. She would spend hours there, her hands buried in the rich soil, the familiar, comforting hum of the earth vibrating through her. The senseless murmuring returned, not as a symptom of stress, but as a natural expression of her communion with the green and growing things around her. Then, a sickness fell upon the pack. It started with the youngest children, a strange lethargy that stole the color from their cheeks and the light from their eyes. The pack's healers, wise in the ways of poultices and tinctures, were baffled. Their most potent remedies had no effect. A quiet fear began to creep through the keep, a shadow that even the constant fires couldn't dispel. One afternoon, watching a mother weep over her listless child, Cora felt a sharp, painful pull from beyond the keep's walls. It was a call from the earth itself, a whisper of disharmony. Driven by an instinct she couldn't explain, she left the gardens and walked into the deep woods that bordered the keep. She didn't notice Rorik following at a distance, his massive form moving with impossible silence, his golden eyes filled with a watchful curiosity. She walked for nearly an hour, her feet finding a path that wasn't there, until she came to a small, shadowed clearing where the very air felt wrong, stagnant and cold. The plants here were withered, their leaves a sickly yellow. Cora knelt, placing her palms flat on the ground. She closed her eyes and let the low, melodic sound spill from her lips. It was the language of the soil, of root and stem. She felt the sickness in the earth, a sour taint that was poisoning the life it was meant to sustain. Her fingers dug into the dirt, guided by the silent song, pushing past common roots until they closed around something small and gnarled. She pulled it free. It was a common-looking thing, a pale, twisted root that the healers would have dismissed as useless. But as she held it, she felt a faint, pure warmth pulse against her palm. It was the antidote. When she returned to the keep, the healers looked at the root with skepticism, but Rorik's silent command was absolute. They prepared it as a tea, and the first child to drink it stirred within the hour, a faint flush of pink returning to their cheeks. By morning, the fever had broken. Cora became a legend overnight. She was no longer just the king's chosen. She was the heart of the forest, the woman who spoke the land's secret language. The pack's reverence deepened into a fierce, protective awe. She had saved their future. That night, Rorik led her to the highest peak of the mountain, to a hidden sanctuary under the full moon. The world spread out below them, a sea of silver-tipped pines. The wind was cold, but he stood as a bulwark against it, his presence a shield of warmth. For a long time they stood in a comfortable silence. Then he spoke, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. For 50 years, I have been king. I have fought wars, built this keep, and held my people together. But we were fading, Cora, losing our connection to the wild magic that gives us our strength. We were becoming tamed. He turned to face her, his golden eyes intense in the moonlight. He gently took her hands in his touch reverent. They saw you as broken, he murmured, his thumb stroking her knuckles. I see you as the only thing that has ever been whole. You don't speak with your mouth, Cora. You speak with your soul, and my soul recognized yours from the moment I saw you. He leaned closer, his gaze dropping to her lips, then meeting her eyes again, asking a silent question. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The kiss was not a thing of passion, but of homecoming. It was a deep, soul-shaking connection, a promise of forever. When he pulled back, his eyes were blazing. The world treated you as a burden, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, so your shoulders would grow strong enough to carry a crown. You are not broken, Cora. You were forged. He lowered his head to the curve of her neck, his breath warm against her skin. Be my queen, my mate, my eternity. She didn't need words. She simply tilted her head, offering herself to him completely. The brief, sharp pressure of his teeth against her shoulder was not painful. It was a seal, a brand of belonging. A faint golden light bloomed from the mark, a searing warmth that spread through her veins, chasing away the last vestiges of the cold, lonely girl she had once been. On her skin, an intricate pattern like the roots of an ancient tree appeared, a permanent declaration. She was his. This was her pack. This was her home. The news from the human lands arrived not with the thunder of war, but with the dry whisper of a desperate scroll. A blight had turned the fields to dust, and a creeping famine was hollowing out the bellies and souls of the people. House Harrow, the scroll pleaded, was on the brink of utter ruin. They begged an audience with the great Lichen King, a plea for aid, for a single scrap from his legendary bounty. The seal, a withered hawk, was a sigil Cora knew like a scar. She traced its impression with a steady finger, feeling nothing, not fear, not anger, only a profound, quiet distance, as if she were reading a history of a girl she once knew. Rorik watched her, his golden eyes unreadable, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He did not need to ask. He knew. They were brought into the great throne room of Shadowfang Keep, a cavernous hall where waterfalls fell like silver veils over living stone. Lord Corbin, Lady Genevieve, and Isolde shuffled forward, their fine silks now frayed and food-stained, their faces pinched with hunger and desperation. They kept their eyes down, terrified of the monstrous king they had come to beg from. They did not see the queen who sat beside him on a throne of polished obsidian and woven roots, a silver circlet resting on her dark hair. It was Isolde who looked up first, her eyes widening in disbelief, then narrowing with a venomous, all-consuming envy. The woman on the throne was Cora, but not Cora. This version was poised, her shoulders straight, her skin glowing with health. The mate's mark, a delicate tracery of silver roots, bloomed on the curve of her neck, a symbol of power and belonging. She wore the wealth of a kingdom not as a costume, but as a second skin. Lord Corbin followed his daughter's gaze, and the blood drained from his face. He stumbled, falling to his knees, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. The silence in the hall was absolute, broken only by the gentle splash of the falls. Rorik did not move, a mountain of silent, lethal judgment at his queen's side. Finally, Cora rose. The movement was fluid, regal. She descended the single step from the dais, her soft leather boots making no sound on the stone floor. She stopped before them, looking down at the family who had cast her out like refuse. Then she spoke. Her voice, when it came, was not the choked, hesitant whisper they remembered. It was clear, steady, and resonant, carrying to every corner of the great hall without effort. It was the voice of a queen. "You sold me for silver to save your house," she said, each word a perfectly polished stone dropped into a still pond. "Look at your house now." Lord Corbin began to babble, apologies and pleas spilling from his lips in a pathetic stream. Isolde just stared, her face a mask of horrified jealousy. Cora held up a hand and her father's words died in his throat. Died. "My silence," she continued, her voice unwavering, "was the price I paid for your cruelty. Now, my voice will be the legacy of your ruin. Consider the debt paid." She turned and gave a slight nod to a guard. The man returned a moment later, dropping a single coarse sack of grain at Lord Corbin's feet. The sound was a dull, final thud. "Take it," Cora commanded, her voice now edged with the cold of the mountain stone around them. "Not for love, but so you may live long enough to remember the treasure you threw away." She turned her back on them then, a dismissal more absolute than any execution. As the guards dragged them from the hall, their wails echoing and then fading into nothing, Cora ascended to her throne and took her place beside her king. Later, from the highest battlement of the keep, she stood with Rorik, the wind whipping her hair as they looked out over their thriving, green lands. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, the scent of life. She leaned against his solid warmth, his arm a comforting weight around her. For 19 years, she had believed she was a burden, a flawed thing whose only purpose was to be discarded. She had been a payment for a debt. But here, in the heart of what the world called a monster's den, she had found her truth. The quiet hum in her soul was not a flaw. It was a song. And this king, this pack, this wild and beautiful land had been the only ones who knew how to listen. She was not a payment. She was a gift. She was not a burden. She was home. She was